Hi there. This is a homily for Ash Wednesday, and the readings today are very much connected with what we heard on the celebration last Sunday. Last Sunday, we were hearing about God as the Holy One and us having to become holy in order to approach Him. So, in other words, God's creation through us is going to be elevated. And of course, we are working with the grace of Christ. And so we hopefully get elevated. We take the rest of the world up with us because that's the situation we're in. Rising tide raises all boats. Now, the readings today, Ash Wednesday, beginning of Lent, mean that we are to be very careful about our attitude to what we're doing. Last time it was our relationship to God. Here it is our relationship to the daily actions of Lent. And bear in mind, we are going towards the great feast of Easter, which is the most holy day when ultimately, yes, Christ rises from the dead. And that is the absolutely marvelous pinnacle that human beings are going to be carried to. But in order to get there in a worthy way, we need to spend 40 days in prayer and fasting and giving alms and trying to change ourselves, because we are not simply waiting for God. God is working with us always. The point is we need to choose how to develop our lives, because our lives are in our hands. Unless we have serious psychological problems, our lives are in our hands, and we don't have wonderful, marvelous excuses for being the way we are. So, starting at the beginning, you have this reading from Joel. By the way, we don't use the prophet Joel very often, but here you have the prophet Joel and the Lord obviously speaking through him. And the Lord says, "Rend your hearts and not your garments." The Jewish people would tear their clothes as a way of indicating public grief, public sadness at sin, perhaps their own sin, perhaps the sin of the people, because the whole people can commit sin very, very well. And we're told to rend our hearts. In other words, let's be conscious that we are begging God in the face of the sin that we have committed. Now, the issue really is, are they conscious of what sins they have committed? And that's a big one, because our culture is very much into self-sufficiency. It is into the idea that if whatever you want to do, that's right, that's okay. And other thoughts along the same lines, but all of them completely misunderstanding what it means to be a human being. And so we are going to have to work on this, and one of the ways is to look into our hearts and see how much we have sinned and how much we should grieve for that sin. The psalm picks that theme up. Be merciful, O Lord, for we have sinned. Here we are recognizing that it's only God who's going to forgive us, and consequently we literally are throwing ourselves on His mercy. Thoroughly wash me from my guilt, and of my sin cleanse me. Here we have another little reality that we can forget very easily, and that is when we sin, we damage our whole existence. And so we need not only to ask forgiveness for our sin, but also to go through the purification of temporal punishment. You can read all about all this in the Catechism. But the point here is there's a lot more to sinning than simply the sin itself. It's all the damage it does to my spirit, my body, because I have sinned. And of course, Ash Wednesday is a really good time to learn a proper theology of sin. Again, there's more here, but we don't have time for that. Paul is explaining to the Corinthians, this is second reading now, for our sake, he made him, that's Christ, to be sin who did not know sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Here we're back to this idea of holiness. God is a just God, and at the end of the world, God will render judgment. We'd better get used to the fact that he is going to judge us, and he is going to judge us in absolutely just terms. So there's no way we can get a second opinion. There's no way that we can kind of charm our way around God. We simply are going to be judged. And this is not a callous judgment. This is not a sadistic judgment. It's God basically saying, okay, you wanted to go down that route instead of coming to me. Well, go down that route and see what happens. Lastly, then, you have the gospel, and this is Matthew's gospel. And Jesus is really talking about, again, this idea of making good for sin. But he says, take care that you don't do this in a visible way. If you give money to somebody, there's a way of doing it that will leave it secret. If you have to, let's see where we are. A lot of this is about giving alms. If you pray, don't do that in public, but rather in the quiet of your own room and in your own heart. But the point always is, when you fast or give alms or pray, you need to make sure that it's not just for public show. And the other side of that is it's not just for me to look good to myself. Well, I said a whole rosary, so of course I must be in angelic power. No, probably not. The whole point here is, let's get a sense of proportion. And part of the sense of proportion is discovering how much we've sinned. The other part of it is, what do we need to do to make good on that sin? Thank you.